Welcome, everybody. Ooh, that's super loud.
That works.
It does. So I'm Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute here at the National World War II Museum, and it's great to have everybody here. Thank you for coming this evening. I think it's going to be an amazing time. You know, before we get started, first in museum tradition to identify some really important people both here in person and at home. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors? If not, let's just give them a round of applause anyway. And then we pass from the World War II veterans, any veterans or active duty service members of our armed forces from any era. Let's recognize you as well. There you go. Thank you for your service. And, you know, of course, they always say, you know, the Army's, the old bumper sticker was Army wife, the toughest job in the Army. Any spouses of active duty service members or veterans, would you please stand and be recognized as well? Thank you for what you do. None of that would be possible. You know, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here this evening. We'd also have an opportunity to recognize our Patriot Circle and Charter members here tonight. You know, your support really allows us to carry on programs like this. So how about if you would be recognized as well? Thank you for what you do. Thanks for that. I should do a shout out too. We've got some teachers here that are here for the museum's teacher workshop. How about a wave from you guys?
Yeah.
Glad you're here. You know, it's incredibly important. Now, 80 years ago today, you know, the Battle of St. Lo and Normandy is raging. You know, you usually think of D-Day as the Normandy campaign, but the campaign's still going on 80 years ago. Americans are preparing to launch Operation Cobra, the breakout from the hedgerow country into the open plains of France, and really continue the liberation of the oppressed peoples. Now, as part of this, there's a massive aerial bombardment, and it results in, you know, probably the most famous or infamous instance of American friendly fire in World War II. And it leads to the death of the subject of tonight's discussion, Lieutenant General Lesley McNair. And General McNair is the most senior U.S. officer killed in the war 80 years ago today. As part of this operation. And, you know, frankly, it's probably one that most people would say, yeah, I don't know anything about him. I was fortunate I was stationed on Fort McNair for over a decade. But we're going to learn even more tonight. So tonight we've got senior historian for the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Dr. Mark Calhoun, who will be discussing his work on McNair, the, quote, unsung architect of the U.S. Army. End quote. Now, I think there'll be something here for everybody because you're like, who's this guy? And why is he important? And why does he matter? Now, Mark earned his PhD in history from the University of Kansas in 2012. His book, General Lesley McNair, Unsung Architect of the U.S. Army, is really the first comprehensive life of General McNair. Mark's current research interests center on General William Simpson, probably another general that we really don't think about much in the war, commander of the 9th U.S. Army, and 9th Army's operations during the campaign in Northwest Europe from 1944 to 45. And Mark's a career U.S. Army Chinook helicopter pilot, war planner, Central Command, G5 of the 101st Airborne Division in Iraq. So he has an impressive resume, both as a scholar and as a soldier and war planner. He retired as lieutenant colonel in 2008 and then served for 14 years as an associate professor at SAMS, the School for Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, where the Army produces the war planners for tomorrow. So pretty impressive resume. He's a great person to have here as we connect this and move forward. Now, interviewing Mark tonight is one of our own, a new addition to the team, Dr. Sean Scanlon. He's joined the Jenny Craig Institute just last month, so be easy on him. Sean's a Western Massachusetts native. He received his PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Not sure how he got from there from Massachusetts, but that's another story. And where his research focused on post-World War II foreign policy. Before joining the museum, Sean was a visiting professor of history at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, and most recently at the University of Mississippi. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Drs. Mark Calhoun and Sean Scanlon this evening. Over to you.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you, Mark, for being here tonight and writing this fascinating book. I want to start off with some sort of general questions. I've read a lot about World War II and know a lot about World War II era generals. And I think I'd heard McNair's name at one point or another, but I don't think I ever knew very much about him. But I want to quote two lines from your book. You quote at one point General Marshall, who called McNair the brains of the Army. And then later on in the book, you call McNair, and I love this quote, a pick and shovel man and one of the Army's most intellectual officers. So I guess my first question for you is, who was Lesley McNair? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got interested in him, why he matters, and perhaps why we don't know his name as well as we should.
Yeah, so I'll start with that last one first. I tell people sometimes that despite the fact that I wrote a book about General McNair, he still remains an unsung architect of the U.S. Army. So somehow the title is still accurate. But he's not a well-known individual. I came across General McNair when I was working on my master's in history at the Command and General Staff College. I was interested in the campaign in North Africa and kind of what went right and what went wrong, and I was reading a lot about kind of the various challenges that the U.S. Army experienced in North Africa, and I kept encountering the name of this general that I'd never heard of, and usually associated with mistakes that were made that played out poorly on the battlefield. So I shelved that away, and I went and I finished the last few years of my active duty career. Decided when I retired I wanted a second career, and I went to KU for my PhD, and I thought this might be an interesting PhD topic and dissertation topic. So I talked to my advisor about it, and I said, you know, I'd really like to write about General McNair. It's interesting because his comment to me was, you know, you might not like him as much as you think you're going to like him after you've researched him. And I said, well, actually, Dr. Wilson, I already kind of have some questions about him, and everything I've read about him so far has been pretty negative. So what I want to find out is, why was he admired by people like George Marshall and you know, some of the other officers, General Eisenhower? And why was he always in these really key positions in his career, and yet he has this reputation now that developed in the 70s and 80s in which he's kind of blamed for a lot of mistakes that were made. So it was kind of a funny moment, because he expected me to want to write this kind of hero profile of this officer, and I didn't expect it to turn out that way at all.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about your research process? Like, what are some of the archives and sources you drew on? Were there any particular challenges or difficulties that you faced in doing research about McNair?
Yeah, there were, but not as many as I was told to expect. So part of this whole kind of mythology that built up around General McNair was that there aren't any papers on General McNair. And I was told that, you know, it was all rumors. Nobody had any, you know, that nobody could say they could prove any of this, but I was told that his wife, in her grief when he died, burned his papers. Mm-hmm. I was told that, you know, there was nothing to find, none of the archives had any material on him, and so, you know, Dr. Wilson was already a little dubious about the project, but I had, you know, other colleagues and historians I knew who were kind of advising me this might not be a good project. You might spend a year or two on it and have nothing to show for it. So, you know, I was a little concerned, but I went to the National Archives in College Park first, and they have a really great collection that's essentially the contents of his office when he died. They just boxed everything up, and it ended up in the archives. And that ended up being a really amazing collection, but one that a lot of historians had already seen, were already aware of. And so then I went to the National Archives in D.C., and they had all of his personnel records up to 1919 and some other really interesting files. But the really surprising thing was when I went to the Library of Congress. And so I went to the Library of Congress, and I went up to the front desk and said, I'm here to research Lesley McNair. Do you have anything on him? And they're like, I don't know, let's see. And so they went back and they took a look in their archives and they said, yeah, we actually have this really interesting collection. I don't know, the person who was helping me said, I don't know if anybody's ever even asked for this before. So they wheeled it out, and it's 9 large boxes of material, some of them quite large because they had sheepskins, the big promotion documents that they gave back then. So I opened up the first box, and what do I find but a note from Claire McNair, his wife, who donated these records to the Library of Congress in the 1950s. So it was an interesting lesson for me as a young historian that sometimes when people think there aren't any records on somebody in the archives, it's because nobody's really looked yet. And again, that was just another thing that kind of made me think, so where did this narrative come from about McNair that's so negative, and yet every archive I go to, I'm finding material that I've never seen cited anywhere. Some of the other archives I went to, there weren't as many records, but and the main sort of hole in the record, I think when Claire donated what she did to the Library of Congress, I think she kept kind of the personal letters and things out of it. So, for example, I don't have any kind of letters exchanged between Claire and her husband during the war. Nothing between General McNair and his son, Doug McNair. So I think that she wanted to kind of keep that stuff private. I've never found anything to prove that, but the fact that none of those kind of really personal things are in the file tells me that. So that was the one thing, and so that kind of led to the fact that this book really isn't a biography. It's more a history of the U.S. Army over a 40-year period, 1904 to 1944, kind of through the eyes of General McNair and his career. So it's really more what the Army was like during that period and his influence on it as it developed and prepared for World War II.
Yeah, and excellent. I want to commend you for staying with it and not bowing out after some advisors told you not to. Maybe you didn't want to keep going. But so you mentioned at one point some of the negative narratives that have built up around McNair. Could you just briefly outline what that narrative is? Because it really seems like in the book you're targeting something very specific, that there's a particular narrative about McNair that you are trying to challenge. Could you briefly outline what that narrative is?
Yeah, so I should start by saying that before I really started studying General McNair, most everything that I found on him in secondary sources and other historians' books only addressed the period from 1940 to 1944. Some people would write about 1939 to 1940 when he was the commandant of the Command and General Staff College. But mostly they talked about the 2 jobs that he held during the war, 1940 to 42 when he's the Chief of Staff of General Headquarters, and then 1942 to 44 when he's the commander of the Army Ground Forces. So that alone was kind of strange that they, that historians only really covered those periods. And the criticisms generally revolved around things that didn't go so well in combat, and this assumption that if he, as General Headquarters Chief of Staff, he was responsible for the mobilization and training of the Army Ground Forces. And then as Ground Forces Commander, as the mobilization process kind of wound down, he's responsible for ensuring that the soldiers in the ground forces have what they need to continue fighting, which includes all the right equipment and materials, but also that the right things are being learned from what's happening at the front and then being integrated into the training that's happening back home. And so, for example, I've read folks would say that General McNair had a World War I mindset. There are books and manuscripts I've seen that have a chapter titled McNair's Folly, and it's about the tank destroyer or pick a thing.
Yeah.
And I get it because it makes a book more interesting if a historian can kind of connect something to an individual, right? And I think that it just became, once a couple of folks do that, it just becomes kind of an easy thing, right? You see something, oh, this historian, he's obviously done his research, he's made this assessment of General McNair, and it just kind of becomes a part of the record.
Right.
And I certainly believed it. None of the weapon systems that we used during the war were perfect, but I can't think of another weapon system like the tank destroyer or the Sherman that one individual has been singled out for criticism. Like this wasn't the best of all the armies on the battlefield in World War II, and it was all this person's fault.
Right.
So it's just an interesting kind of way that this developed, and and it took me a while to realize that I wasn't really agreeing with it. As the more I dug into, and especially his early career, the more I dug into the things he did before those 4 years that they were writing about, the more I thought, you know, some of these criticisms aren't really fair. I'll just give you one example. There are a bunch of them. McNair was involved heavily in the Louisiana and Carolina and Tennessee maneuvers. The first maneuvers in 1941, the Louisiana maneuvers in particular, are really well known. And you know, there were criticisms of the way the maneuvers went, the approach that they took, and the lessons that they learned. And I had read things like, why is General McNair involved in the Army's combined arms doctrine? He's just a field artillery officer. He's not qualified to do that. Why is he developing field tests and umpire procedures for field tests? He's not qualified to do this. When I looked at his early career, for example, when he was at the Army War College in 1928 to 29, the Army War College did exercises, and General McNair, as a student, was the lead umpire for their capstone exercise, their big exercise at the end of the course. So, you know, right there, that changes the narrative, right?
Sure.
He's not qualified to do this. Oh, wait, he's actually got probably more experience than many people, many officers in the Army at that point in his career. And I kept finding examples like that. So that's kind of what got me gradually to start seeing him differently.
Fantastic. Well, I want to sort of circle back to some of those topics because we will spend plenty of time on World War II. But in the interest of sort of correcting filling that gap you identified, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about McNair's early life, and especially his early military career. Could you tell us a little bit about where he grew up and maybe what made him decide to choose a career in the military?
Yeah, sure. He grew up. He had a rural childhood in Minnesota. His father ran a lumber business, and so he had a camp in the woods that he absolutely loved. And he would, you know, when he had an opportunity, he would retreat to his camp and enjoy the peace and quiet. But Lesley McNair was a brilliant student, and where they lived, he really only had the opportunity to do a junior high school education. I have never found anything that indicates what it was that made General McNair want to join the military, but he wanted to go, actually he wanted to be a naval officer. But, you know, he wouldn't have any hope of being able to do that without a good high school education. So his father actually sold his camp in the woods, sold his lumber business, and moved the family to Verndale, Minnesota, so that General McNair could have that opportunity. And the teachers in the room will probably appreciate when the book came out and I had an opportunity to go to Verndale, I went to the school that General McNair went to as a high school student, and I told these kids, you need to appreciate this opportunity that you have. People have sacrificed over the years to have the opportunity to send their kids to get a decent high school education. You know, who knows if I got through to them or not, but that was the idea, right? But
At least one.
Yeah, I think this, just his talent as a student and the fact that his family was willing to sacrifice to make this opportunity available to him. When he got closer to making the decision, you know, the opportunity to go to the Naval Academy, with the waiting list was very, very long, and West Point said, we'll take you right now. So he chose to go to West Point instead.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about what so he goes to West Point. What year did he graduate? 1904?
1904.
So he's commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1904. What does the United States Army look like in 1904?
Yeah, a lot different. It's basically a frontier army. You know, these folks are operating on tiny little outposts in Montana and, you know, at just various places in the West. You know, there's very little to do in the evenings. I think one of the best sources to read on this is Matt Kaufman's The Regulars. The Old Army is also great, but it kind of goes back to the 19th century. But Matt Kaufman just paints this really, really amazing portrait of what Army life was like in the early World War I to World War II era. But before World War I, folks really spent most of their time out on these little Western outposts, training their soldiers and developing procedures, and then trying to find things to keep them busy, because there wasn't a whole lot to do. So they would have football teams, they would have socials where they'd try to bring people in from whatever communities were around the post and have social events. It was a very formal army at the time. In the evenings after the training day was done, officers would go back to their homes or their billets, and they would put on their dress uniforms and sit out on their porch with their spouse or their family and drink or tea or happy hour drinks or whatever. And folks would kind of wander and just have social get-togethers at different people's houses. So it was a very, very different time. And you know, it was a difficult thing for spouses. McNair wasn't married at this point. So the first kind of big thing that happens in his career, in 1904, he heads out west to Montana, Fort Douglas, and he has a girlfriend, and she's out east, Claire. And so because probably, I haven't ever read anything that proves this, but he wanted to be near Claire and had designs of getting her to marry him. And so he asked for an ordnance branch detail. And when I read about this really flipped a switch in my mind on understanding what McNair did during his career and why. Because the ordnance branch is responsible for developing all the equipment that the Army uses, or the Army Ordnance Branch. So they do the testing, the development, the production. You know, the field testing after production. They do this whole process, and it's a very kind of scientific and analytical thing. And so, sort of as a side product of this desire to go be near his future wife, he gets this amazing 4-year education in what ordnance does. And so after that, he's just involved in test after test, where he's designing new equipment, or actually I have some photos. So this is a couple of his soldiers after he goes back out west from his ordnance detail. There was a pack saddle the Army was using at the time on the light artillery mules. And this pack saddle, it required contractors to load it and unload it because it was so complicated. And it injured the mules. On long road marches, the mules would have, sores on their back from this pack saddle. And so General McNair knew there were other pack saddles out there that were options, and he also designed one himself. And then he took his unit on a 500-mile march down south and then back up into Colorado. He set a new record for the highest altitude firing mission for mountain artillery up to that point. And this whole road march was also a very sort of deliberate scientific test of these saddles. And he continued to do this kind of thing throughout his career. He designed a 3-inch mountain artillery piece. He was working on sights for artillery weapons, improved sights. So, as you go through his career, he continues to do this kind of thing. He already had he was excellent in mathematics at West Point. He was actually very good at drawing, and so he kind of had some of these natural abilities, and spending that 4 years with the Ordnance Branch really honed them into this way of looking at the Army that if the equipment we have isn't suitable, then let's make something better.
Yeah, I think that's a theme that's going to recur throughout his career, and I want to come back to it a little bit later on. But it strikes me as that one of the next sort of really impactful moments in McNair's life and career is the First World War. Could you talk a little bit about what duties he's assigned during the First World War and how that experience sort of shapes his views on doctrine and his sort of career trajectory?
Absolutely. So we'll fast forward through. This is General McNair. This is Captain McNair's field artillery battery in Mexico before the punitive expedition, or as part of the punitive expedition. And on this expedition, he worked for General Pershing. And so he came to the attention of General Pershing. And so this is McNair in 1918. At this point, he's the youngest general officer in the U.S. Army. General Pershing selected him to be on the Army Expeditionary Force staff, and he was the light artillery training officer. And one of the things you see right away in his experience during World War I is the same restless kind of spirit of let's figure out new ways to do things. And so I found an article in the Field Artillery Journal, which it's amazing. All the issues of the Field Artillery Journal dating basically all the way back are available online. And he wrote an article during the war, infantry and its accompanying guns. And the idea of the article is, and this was a problem throughout World War I, the infantry could attack and could generally make progress as long as they're under the curtain of artillery that's kind of leading them forward. Once they get outside of that range, then they really get bogged down against this powerful enemy defense, and they can't proceed any further. And so he's trying to experiment with new ways to have guns bound forward with artillery as they advance, so that the artillery can keep the infantry moving forward, and so that once they have reached the limit of advance, they have artillery that can support them, and they're not just, subject to the enemy's artillery without any way to respond.
Yeah. So one thing that struck me about McNair's career is that so he achieves high rank during the war, but he's reduced in rank back to his permanent grade of major, right, after the war?
That's right, yeah. So this is him. So on the, I guess that would be y'all's right. That's General Pershing awarding McNair the Distinguished Service Medal at the end of the war. And then on the left is Marshal Pétain, giving him the Legion of Honor, with Pershing looking on very proudly. So Pershing had a very high regard for General McNair. And then that's a little bit later, so we'll come back to that. So one of the things that made him really lucky, during the interwar period, you had this phenomenon called the hump. Now in the military today, we have an up-or-out system. So put simply, if you get promoted to a certain rank, you're going to be that rank a certain number of years, and then you're going to have a board that's going to consider you for the next rank. And if you don't make it, then you have to leave the military. They didn't have this in the interwar period, and so officers that reached senior rank looked out at the civilian economy and said, this Depression-era kind of economy doesn't look so good. I think I'm going to hang around in the Army. And so this is why you ended up with a lot of folks that were, significantly older than you would normally have in their rank, not necessarily as proficient or as fit as they should be for the positions that they were in. And so it created what they referred to as a hump, because all these junior officers got hung up at the rank of captain, in some cases major. McNair was fortunate enough that he had the rank of major already, so when he was reverted back to his permanent rank, he continued to kind of get promoted on time. Folks just a couple years behind him got stuck at captain and would remain captains throughout the 20s and even into the 30s. So that was an interesting sort of difference for him and other folks in his age group.
Yeah. So McNair has a bunch of different assignments throughout the 20s and 30s in the lead up to the Second World War. But it struck me that one of the sort of core themes, or one of the sort of things that keeps coming up again and again in his career is education, either as a student, as a teacher, as an administrator, or as sort of author of curriculum. Could you talk a little bit about how education plays a role in McNair's career, and maybe what specific areas he was most interested in, had the most influence on?
Yeah, so I think the main reason that education became so important for him is that he was such a gifted student to begin with. And he had a reputation for, like you mentioned the quote, a pick and shovel kind of an officer, but also someone with a serious intellect. Most officers in this period, though, ended up in a lot of educational type assignments. Like Professor of Military Science for an ROTC unit was a very common assignment. He worked with Civilian Conservation Corps, and at the regional CCC camp that he set up, they built a school for the children of the folks working at this Civilian Conservation Corps camp. So he keeps kind of serving in these positions where he's doing educational type work, and he's just really, really good at it. But I've never really seen any evidence that he was specifically targeted to go into those positions until later in his career. The main one I'll mention that does really, it becomes a deliberate choice is when General Marshall picks him to be the commandant of the Command and General Staff College in 1939, and this is because General Marshall knows that we need to get on a war footing. And one of the things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to modify this course, both to emphasize the fact that we may be in war soon, and also if we do end up in the war, we're going to have to shorten it quite a bit, because we won't be able to afford to let people go to school for an entire year. So the first year that he's there, he's really just focused on making the course better, kind of upping the academic sort of rigor of the course. But then the second year, he actually is responsible for making the course the shortened version that it becomes. you know, there's some fascinating things that he has an NCO that's responsible for the grading of the students in the school.
Oh, that's
And
lucky him.
Yeah, and there's this long paper. It's all about maintaining the class rank, because the class rank is very important, right? If you graduate at the top of your class, that's going to have a huge impact on your career. And it was so competitive at the top that General McNair realized, you know, we need to go to the third decimal place. So 99.22 isn't accurate enough, because this, you know, one soldier might have .223 and one might have .224. And you can't round either one of those up, so you need to go to the third decimal place. And so there's this lengthy paper, and there's these letters exchanged between General McNair and this NCO on should we go to third decimal place or not, and if so, how's it going to work? But, you know, it just goes to show the fact that he understood that this education these officers were getting was important, and it was worth making sure that they got the recognition that they deserve for doing well. But, you know, while he was the ROTC professor of military science, he was very highly regarded. He actually got his cadets involved in debating with pacifists who, you know, there wasn't a huge pacifist movement in the United States in the interwar period, but it was there, and there was a famous pacifist who was going to come through town. This was at Purdue, is where he did his ROTC assignment. And so he actually had his cadets prepare and study on this pacifist movement and this gentleman's arguments, and then had them all go to his presentation and very respectfully ask hard questions and put their ideas forward on why we need a military that's prepared. So, you know, you just see him really going above and beyond in these educational jobs that he found himself in.
Yeah. So we're coming closer and closer towards the late 1930s and towards the moment when the Americans are starting to look abroad and say that war seems more and more likely. And so to prepare for that, the Army and the military in general has to sort of get ready and start to mobilize. Could you talk about McNair's role in sort of helping the Army gear up for war? And maybe what are some of the particular initiatives or programs that he's involved in? You mentioned earlier the 41 maneuvers in the South, for instance. Could you talk a little bit more about McNair as a sort of architect of mobilization?
Sure. Yeah, so this is him as a professor of military science. This is, he's a lieutenant colonel at this point. But yeah, you know, as war is approaching, there's an understanding that a lot of things are going to have to change in the Army. But, you know, the process really got started pretty early on, even before the war began. The Army is trying to think about what modern war is going to look like and modify or update the Army's force structure and equipment to match their vision of what future warfare will be. And this is where I find the accusation that McNair has a World War I mindset so hard to buy, because he's one of the leading individuals trying to break the Army out of that mold and help the Army think about what the future of warfare is going to look like. So I don't know if you've heard of the triangular division, but in the interwar period, the Army modified the structure of its divisions from this really huge, kind of cumbersome square organization with 4 brigades and around 20,000 troops to a much more lean triangular organization with 3 regiments, around 13,000 troops. And much of the equipment that had been, so it makes for a smoother task organization of what's in the division, but it also takes a lot of the additional sort of support equipment out and pulls it at corps level. You know, and there is a huge debate over whether this is a good idea or not. And it actually turns out quite well during the war. But General McNair, this is while he's a brigade commander. He's a field artillery brigade commander. But he's put in this role where he's the chief of staff of this test division. And so he helps design the division. He helps design the tests for the division. General Kruger is the commander. And they put this triangular organization through a bunch of tests. This is before the war is even broken out. And they're trying to optimize the division for what they think the future of war is going to look like, which is much more mobile. You know, it's much more about combining your different arms, so finding ways for the infantry, the armor, the artillery to all cooperate together and work as a greater than the sum of their parts. and ways to streamline the size of units to meet the need of this kind of more mobile, more rapid form of warfare. It's all based on an idea that General Pershing talked about during World War I called open warfare. So General Pershing came up with this concept that he believed it was based in our frontier tradition. You know, when we had these units out in the West with huge kind of open spaces, and when they needed to go out and perform some kind of security mission, they had to move over long distances and use their mobility and their shock kind of power to achieve their mission. And he kind of also used it as a way to help make the argument that we shouldn't put American troops underneath British or French command. That American troops had this unique approach to warfare and needed to fight differently. And so the folks who, during the war, who really kind of bought into this open warfare concept that they weren't ever really completely able to achieve during World War I, wanted to make this happen. And so you see letters exchanged between General Marshall and General McNair, or all these other individuals involved in these tests, and they constantly refer to this idea of open warfare, and how do we make our military more capable of doing that. So it's it's his whole career that's kind of taken him to the point where, you know, he's got all this experience doing testing and evaluation of equipment, being an umpire, designing exercises, training and testing units. And so once he's done this experiment and two different versions of this triangular division, while it's in the final steps of getting approved, that's when the war's now going, and he ends up, you know, in his later jobs. But you see this sort of path where every job that he has seems like it's preparing him better for what he's going to end up doing during World War II.
Well, okay, so now that we've gotten McNair to the war, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about McNair's contributions to to Army effectiveness. I want to sort of end with a big question that I think you'll have very strong opinions about. But in terms of some specific steps that McNair is taking, like you talk quite a bit about personnel policy, for instance. Could you talk a little bit about how McNair is helping to shape what kinds of soldiers and officers are deploying overseas?
Yeah, this is the point in his career where General McNair really starts to get frustrated. So there's an idea as we're beginning protective mobilization and realizing that we're going to get involved in this war one way or another. There's a term that's bandied about called the war of machines. You know, the folks view the airplane and some of the other new technologies that we're starting to see that are really starting to look like they have great potential. You know, you had some capabilities during World War I. The airplane was really too new and immature to really be decisive on the battlefield, but you could see its promise. Same thing with radios, and you know, whether or not we can make light enough radios that they can move and enable artillery to move more effectively. You know, so by the time we're on the cusp of World War II, of getting involved in it directly, this war of machines idea has really taken hold, and you know, everybody from Roosevelt on down kind of view this as it's going to be a high-tech war. And so one of the results of that is there's this idea that we need our best recruits to go into the high-tech fields. Well, at the time, best recruits meant two different factors. They were given a test that was sort of like an IQ test, but it was supposed to test their ability to learn. And you know, at this time, a lot of the folks going to recruiting stations had maybe 8th grade, 7th grade educations. So like most IQ tests, there's a bias towards people with an education, and they're not really well designed. But they did tend to show folks who had a better or a not as good sort of level of education before they got recruited. The other thing, though, that really surprised me is the physical tests. So both just the medical evaluation, you know, how tall and how fit is the individual. And so they categorized soldiers from 1 to 5 in both of these sort of categories, 5 being the best. And very quickly, it became obvious that the War Department was going to bias the recruits with the higher scores to the Army Service Forces, and in particular, the Army Air Forces. So there's this idea that you don't need to be particularly strong or bright to be an infantry soldier. You just go where you're told and point your weapon where you're told to point it and shoot. When I was just in Normandy recently, and my tour guide, I took some college students, and we had a wonderful local tour guide. And Tomas said at one point, when these folks landed on the beaches on D-Day, a lot of soldiers ended up in deep water and had to drop all of their gear. And so they arrive on the beach, and all they have to work with is their mind. And I didn't prep him to say this. This wasn't rehearsed. But it was like the perfect thing that, to me, that epitomizes the lack of sort of logic in this policy.
Yeah.
That the mental strain of being an infantry soldier in combat is certainly as difficult as the mental strain of operating a piece of equipment. Now, some equipment gets complex enough that you might need some specialized training to do it, but the idea that you don't need to have a powerful intellect or a strong body to be a ground forces soldier just really seems strange to me looking back on it. But this was the way people viewed it. So General McNair had to struggle with this constantly, that all these great recruits that he felt like he should be getting his fair share of are being siphoned off to the service forces and the air forces. And it's a problem that he can't seem to get across to anyone. General Marshall and the folks at the War Department don't see a problem with this policy until later in the war, when General McNair points out that somewhere around 10% of the ground forces are infantry, and they're suffering more than 70% of the casualties. And so we're getting later into the war now, but this leads to some policies like the creation of the combat infantryman badge, infantry for a day, where family members could go to Army bases and train like the soldiers trained as they're going through their recruitment training process. There were a number of initiatives where they're trying to raise sort of the image of the infantry and armor and artillery, the ground forces soldiers, so that recruits wouldn't do everything they could do to avoid being in those branches. This is General McNair on Armistice Day in 1942 giving a speech on the Blue Network. The short kind of nickname for the speech is the kill or be killed speech. But what he's trying to do is to get across to people that, we're sending troops to North Africa to engage directly in ground combat with the Axis. We're getting involved and we've been involved for a while now in combat in the Pacific. The war's getting real, and people need to know what to expect. But soldiers in particular need to realize that, they're going to encounter professionals who have learned to do what has to be done to win, and that our soldiers are going to need to come out of the training mindset and develop this sort of hatred of the enemy, so that they don't hesitate when it's necessary to do what they have to do to win. And it came across, the collection at the Library of Congress had dozens of letters that he received. I'd say 80% of the letters were positive, and 20% of them, people were shocked and thought it was a really inappropriate things for him to say, but it was something that was necessary and important to get it across to people what this is really going to involve.
Yeah, you quote at length from the speech, and he's not mincing words at all about what this is going to require of American soldiers.
That's right.
So, given that we're getting close to the end of this portion of the evening, I want to ask you a question that I think is central to your book. In addition to sort of reconsidering McNair's career, you're also making a very sort of distinct pointed intervention about a topic that historians have been sort of arguing about for a while, which is sort of how do you explain the effectiveness of the U.S. Army during World War II? So I just want to put it to you plain and simple. How do you explain the success of the U.S. Army during World War II, and how does McNair contribute to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a couple arguments that I kind of try to make in the book. I think that there's been a huge emphasis on a couple of factors that I think are overemphasized. The material superiority argument is one. This idea that we had such an overwhelming amount of equipment that we could lose tons of equipment and just replace it. And that this overwhelming material superiority sort of guaranteed that we were going to win, which I definitely don't agree with. And so that's one argument that I think doesn't make a lot of sense. Another one is this really heavy emphasis on adaptation, in the sense that we're kind of making things up as we go along that aren't at all similar to what the soldiers were trained to do. Like, our doctrine is garbage. We're going to have to throw it out and make up something completely different. When you look at the adaptations that happen at the front, they're adaptations that make us better able to execute our doctrine as it's written, not throw it out and do something completely different. And so what I try to emphasize in the book is that it's really just a learning process. You know, you have soldiers who are, the training method that General McNair developed to prepare the soldiers for World War II is essentially the same training method we use today. The soldiers start individual training, getting physically fit, learning how to wear their uniforms, who to salute, who not to salute, you know, all these basic things, how to fire their rifle or whatever their weapon system is. And then it gradually moves up from the individual to the small unit, to the larger unit, and then to this kind of collective training. It's exactly what we do today. And so another thing that was really important is, and I'll, oh, it doesn't want to advance. Okay, I guess we're not going to see that. But another thing that he did is he realized very quickly that we were going to learn things at the front that we needed to integrate into our training back home. And so he didn't mess around with this. General Simpson, the guy I'm writing about now, was a corps commander at the Tennessee maneuvers. And in 1943, as things are kind of winding down in Tunisia, General McNair sends General Simpson to North Africa to do, you know, a tour talking to senior commanders all the way down to soldiers and units that had been fighting in Tunisia to find out what went well, what didn't go well, and then to bring those things back and integrate them into the training at home. And this went on, I mean, it certainly wasn't unique to Simpson or North Africa. This went on throughout the war continually. And McNair put real resources into doing this and modified and updated the training that went on at home so that soldiers would arrive at the front with a better idea of what they were actually going to encounter, and that once they got to the front, that they could quickly get battle hardened and learn what it was that they were going to be expected to do and get better at doing it. But the way they were trained to do, one of General Simpson's favorite things to say, he would tell his staff all the time, we're going to do things the way we were taught to do it at CGSC, this Command and General Staff College. We're not going to make up, you know, novel ways of doing things. We're going to operate like we were trained so that we all understand what each other's jobs are, and all the other units will understand what we're doing as well. And so I think that we've overemphasized in the historical narrative about World War II this idea of material superiority. Was it important that we were able to produce an incredible volume of, absolutely, it was certainly important to our allies. We relied very heavily on Lend-Lease. But the idea that we didn't need soldiers and officers who were dedicated professionals, who were well-trained, and who were able to learn in combat how to be more effective with the equipment and the training that they had. I think that's far more important than having extra tanks or extra artillery pieces in the rear that they could draw on.
Yeah, it strikes me that it's the sort of the process and the training and the education, these things that might not be as sort of exciting as the newest and most advanced piece of equipment. It's like it's these core things that matter. Would that be an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I think so. And so this picture, thanks to whoever advanced it, I appreciate that. This is General McNair in the middle. This is, so General Simpson is the tall gentleman there on McNair's left, and this is a soldier on McNair's right, and McNair has a shoe in his hands. McNair actually wrote a fairly lengthy study of the footwear that soldiers were issued in the 1930s, arguing that they needed better footwear and laying out the case for why this footwear is bad and that it needs to be improved. So here he is actually inspecting the footwear and asking one of these soldiers who has to wear this stuff, you know, what do you think of this? Is it working out okay for you? This is also the inspection where he decided that General Simpson had potential to be a Field Army commander and recommended him for Field Army command. But it's also really cool because General Simpson was one of the last people to see General McNair alive. I didn't know this until I had already been researching General Simpson in the Ninth Army for a couple of years, and a friend discovered a note in an archive that Simpson actually wrote down this story of being one of the last people to see General McNair.
So you mentioned General Simpson, and as I'm sure your current project is going to show, he's a field commander, but McNair's a staff officer, and sort of remains a staff officer throughout most of his career. And this is going to be my last question before we open up to the audience.
Okay.
But you make a point towards the end, which I, as a historian, find really interesting, which is the importance of staff officers, and in particular how staff officers can be useful to us to understand these broader trends in the Army. I think that there's a tendency to focus so much on the combat commanders, on Patton, for instance. But I wonder if you could elaborate on what value studying staff officers could bring to our understanding of the military.
Yeah. This could be a very long answer, but I'll focus on one thing that I've actually learned a lot about fairly recently, and that is when you read about operations and the planning that goes into them in most histories, you read about General Bradley planning Operation Cobra. General Bradley was certainly involved in planning Operation Cobra, but and there were other generals who were commanding units like General Pete Casada, an Army Air Corps, Army Air Force officer who was extremely talented. But the bulk of the planning is done by subordinate officers. So one of the things that I've been studying quite a bit is the planning for D-Day, which took over 2 years. And it began with a couple of folks who formed this small organization, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Allied Commander. So they're staff officers who work as the Chief of Staff and his staff for a commander that hasn't even been named yet. And so if you really want to understand how we arrived at the plan for Normandy, you can't start with Eisenhower and Montgomery and Bradley, because they inherit a plan that's already been in development for a couple of years. They make some important changes to it, certainly, and they're the people who are going to execute the plan and make it work. But if you really want to understand how it got to look the way it did in 1944, it's really important to go back and look at these various planners and staff officers who had all these debates and conferences and did all the work to actually develop the plan and make it end up what it was.
Well, excellent. Thanks so much, Mark. I think we're at our time for this portion of the evening, so I'm going to turn things over to Jeremy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to Sean and to Mark. Round of applause, please. The first question will go in the front to your right with Mike here.
So, Mark, I guess you're not going to guess what I'm going to ask about. You skipped over General McNair's contribution to field artillery in the interwar years. And there's a real reason why the post headquarters at Fort Sill is named McNair Hall, isn't there?
That's right. That's right. So in the in the 1920s, there was no understanding of how to mass fires, to mass observe fires, and there was a cultural. Again, this is another. Thanks, Mike, for the question. I appreciate it. This is another great example of McNair being a real forward thinker. In the field artillery after World War I, there's this idea that battery commanders have the authority to control their guns and where their guns are going to fire. And so batteries are the basic, this small unit, batteries are the basic unit of fire, and the battery commander controls the fire of his guns. And so you might have 3 different batteries, and there are people in the 20s talking about the idea that, well, maybe if we had the battalion control the fires, we could mass these 3 batteries and all of their fire could land on one target simultaneously. Well, there are 2 problems. One, we don't have any idea how to do it. The radios aren't good enough. We don't know how to do the targeting method with the slide rule and the protractors and everything. But more importantly, at the time, the field artillery branch is completely opposed to this idea. The traditionalists in the field artillery don't want anything to do with it. So General McNair, I showed the picture earlier, a lieutenant colonel shows up at the field artillery school, and he's the assistant commandant. And he's had some really talented officers in the gunnery department before he showed up there, and while he's there, folks like Jake Devers and Carlos Brewer, Orlando Ward. I mean, these are officers that many of you have probably heard of from campaigns that they were involved in later that have been doing a lot of experimentations, but they're having to go in on the weekends because if anybody realizes what they're doing, they're going to shut it down. And General McNair learns of this, and he provides top cover. He makes sure that nobody knows what they're doing and that nobody can argue with it. And then as it starts to show real results, he starts to make sure that he's talking to the right people so that the results will outweigh the efforts to quash what they're doing. And so by the time we enter the war, we've got, I believe, the most advanced capability of any artillery. I think the British have amazing artillery during the war, but our ability to mass observe fires on a target is the best of any army in the war, and it goes right back to that interwar period of about 6-8 years at the Field Artillery School, culminating in that 2 years that General McNair is there, helping them finish this process of developing this procedure.
Right here in the center aisle.
Yes, sir. You mentioned the controversy over tank destroyers. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit. And I was just wondering, since we're next to an 88, did it have anything to do with us not fielding the 90 millimeter till late in the war?
So those are kind of two different issues. The tank destroyer issue, there are a couple of things that sort of happen with tank destroyers. The first thing to know about a tank destroyer is the idea is to put a gun on the battlefield in a cheaper, faster vehicle, right? So the turret doesn't have a top on it. It's an open turret. The armor isn't as heavy, so the crew is more exposed and more vulnerable to enemy fire. But the tank destroyers in general had more powerful guns than many of the lighter tanks had, and they were fast. What ends up happening, though, as the tank destroyer center is stood up in Texas, there's a fellow named General Bruce put in charge of it. General Bruce sort of takes the basic concept for tank destroyers and he sort of, amps it up a little bit, and he comes up with this motto: seek, strike, and destroy. And the idea is that tank destroyers are going to be this really aggressive arm that's able to chase enemy armor and take the fight right to them. Well, it ends up becoming this kind of overly aggressive approach to fighting tank destroyers that doesn't sort of recognize their vulnerability. And it makes them suffer a lot of casualties because they're much more exposed than they should be. And it takes McNair a little bit of time to realize that this is happening because he's not working at the Tank Destroyer Center. He's got all of the ground forces he's concerned about. When he does find out about it, he goes, he spends a lot of time there. They refine the doctrine, and it gets a lot better. But from that going forward, there's this kind of concern about tank destroyers, and there's this idea that General McNair is involved in their development. Look how vulnerable they are. Look at the casualties they suffer. The reality is that a lot of the reason they suffer a lot of casualties is that a lot of the troops on the ground don't really understand their limitations. And so you read these stories about commanders coming down to a regiment, and there's a tank destroyer unit supporting them and ordering these tank destroyers to literally go right down a road in column to lead the attack, and they just get picked off one after another. Just a lack of understanding what they're able to do. The 90 millimeter on the Pershing. So the problem with developing a heavy tank, I'll say first of all that this is something that McNair is criticized for, and I can understand why. There was a huge debate about what's the best way to defeat enemy tanks. McNair was firmly convinced, and many of his peers and colleagues agreed, that it's not the most efficient use of our tanks for them to be the tank killer. Our tanks are better suited to use their mobility to encircle, to flank attack, to attack enemy rear areas, to exploit a retreating enemy, to use their speed and firepower in situations where they have a real advantage over the enemy. And that we need a mobile capability to defeat enemy tanks, but we ought to use anti-tank guns, which is a more efficient and more appropriate way to do it. So this is the basic mindset that's driving his opinions on the development of tanks. When the Ordnance Branch starts working on heavy tanks, they're trying to use a couple of different drivetrains, a couple of different types of suspensions, and basically they're unable to produce a prototype that passes any of the initial fielding tests. And so you have this record where McNair is constantly coming out against the idea of going into production on a heavy tank prototype, not because he doesn't think we need one, but because none of the prototypes are even close to being ready to go into production yet. So by the time the T-23 is the main prototype that becomes the Pershing, by the time it's actually ready to begin that process of going into production, it's 1944, late in 44. When they finally make it to the front during the Rhine crossing, all the other tanks are able to cross the Rhine with the unit they're supporting. They have to extend the bridges and make them wider for the Pershing to even be able to get across a river. So these are the kind of challenges that McNair knew we were going to face if we fielded a larger tank. You know, the counter argument was, yes, but the Shermans are really vulnerable, and Tigers and Panthers can kill Shermans. It takes several Shermans to... That's true in the rare cases where Shermans end up in a gun duel with a German heavy tank. Yeah, they're outclassed. On the other hand, the Sherman's very reliable. You know, when a Tiger company started, went on an attack, 20-30% of their Tigers wouldn't even start. They'd get caught on narrow roads and not be able to turn around. They had all kinds of challenges, but in just a tank-on-tank duel, sure, the Tiger or the Panther could beat the Sherman just about every time. But the Sherman, one of the things I've heard that I really agree with is the tank that gets off the first shot is more likely to win the engagement. And the Sherman could traverse faster, it could sight in on the enemy faster, and it almost always could get the first round off. And if you had 2 or 3 of them, they could flank, find a vulnerable spot to engage the enemy tank and win the engagement. These are the things that, you know, the story gets kind of simplified. McNair didn't think we should have a heavy tank, and so lots of soldiers died in the Sherman or the Stuart because he opposed the development of a heavy tank. And the story is a lot more, there's a lot more sort of subtlety to it than that.
We'll get 1 or 2 more questions, depending on the length of the question and the length of the answer.
And the length of the answer.
Well,
right?
this will be a quick question.
Okay, I'll try to make a quick answer.
You mentioned that he was killed by friendly fire. So what happened there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, General Simpson was one of the last people to see him alive. So on the 24th of July, 1944, is supposed to be the date that Operation Cobra happens. And the idea is that we're gonna pound the German lines with a really heavy bombardment, and we're gonna have our troops so close to the target box that the Germans are still gonna be overwhelmed by the bombardment when we lead off and begin the attack, and we're gonna be so close to them they won't have a chance to recover. This is Bradley's big gamble to break out of the hedgerows and get the attack moving. On the 24th of July, the bombers come in from the north, perpendicular to the target box, and they drop short, and a bunch of rounds land on friendly troops, suffer about 100 casualties. General McNair has been selected for Field Army Command. He's going to go replace General Patton in the 1st U.S. Army Group when General Patton brings 3rd Army into France. And so he's sent to the front to be visible and kind of generate some media buzz. Well, he went to the front to observe, and he's kind of close to where these short rounds are falling. So when the dust settles, they call off Cobra for the day. Bradley reschedules it for the next day, and McNair goes back to the rear, and he's decided, his aides have convinced him he can't go back to the front the next day. It's just too dangerous. Well, he goes to get some chow, and he runs into some soldiers, and the soldiers say, "Sir, I can't tell you how much it meant to us to see a general officer, a senior general officer at the front willing to take the risk that we take." Well, of course, McNair's got to go back now. He saw General Simpson and tried to convince him to go with him. And Simpson said, "I have to get back to my headquarters. My plane's leaving in a minute," which worked out pretty well because on the 25th, the short drops were even worse, significantly more casualties, and General McNair's foxhole took a direct hit. The ring you see in the photo there is his West Point class ring. The way they were able to identify his remains when they found him was that ring and a 3-star epaulette from his uniform. So his foxhole took a direct hit.
So we had 1 more question, but in lieu of question, he gets a free copy of the book that he gets signed first. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean Scanlon and Mark Calhoun. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks to Sean for moderating. You passed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mark for sharing his work, talking about tanks. You know, aviators don't usually do that. So great on that, on this anniversary of General McNair's untimely death. Mark will be signing copies of his book, you know, back at the table. Mark your calendars for August 22nd, which is our next Meet the Author event. We've got Dr. Stephen Sears coming. He'll discuss his book, Sunniland, which is a historical fiction based on U-boat activity in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as his own involvement in a scuba dive on German submarine U-166, which is right off the Louisiana coast. So kind of a little local history of German U-boats here in the neighborhood. Once again, let's give Mark and Sean a round of applause.
All right.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it.